Hey guys, Nancy here with T-Cell Logic. Hope you're all doing good. Today our case is about the Hi-Fi murders, which took place on April 22nd, 1974 in Ogden, Utah. It took place at the Hi-Fi home audio store. Yes, just wanted to mention that this case is remarkable. Oftentimes it is used during FBI training for people who want to become FBI agents. It offers a good deal of wisdom as far as like the investigation and investigation tactics. A lot of people feel that the trial was racially biased. We'll get into that towards the end, but this case is certainly one that's very important. I just wanted to point that out. So that day went as usual, that is until closing time came around. Right before Hi-Fi Audio closed, two men arrived at the store and they came inside and they were just browsing around like any other customer would be, which is fine and all, except these two men weren't there just browsing for audio equipment. They were there to raise an absolute hell. So these guys would go on to commit heinous acts of violence, absolutely cruel. The kind of cruelness that you can't even imagine would exist in people. And it's really scary that there are people out there who can get to this level of violence. Because of the violent nature of this crime, I mean, it's not just violent, it's really violent and really cruel. So if that's not your thing, you know what to do. Viewer discretion is advised. Hi-Fi Home Audio Store, April 22nd, 1974, Ogden, Utah. It was shortly before closing time when two vans arrived at the store. The main culprits this night, Pierre Dale Selby and his buddy William Andrews. They were both 19 years old at the time, and they were both in the Air Force. They were based in Ogden, Utah. So these two guys went into the store. While they were in there, they both pulled out the handguns that they were carrying. Outside in the van was another one of their buddies, Keith Leon Roberts, and there were some other men that were there as well. I believe the total number of men was about 8 or 6. I just wanted to clarify that the main culprits, the main criminals here, were Pierre Dale Selby and William Andrews, and then Keith Leon Roberts was out in the van. He didn't really do much, but he was ultimately charged in this case, unlike the other guys. There were two employees at Hi-Fi Audio that night. Stanley Walker, who was 20 years old, and the store manager was there, as well as Michelle Ansley, who was 18 years old and a new employee. When Selby and Andrews pulled out their guns, they ordered Michelle and Stanley down to the basement, where they tied them up. They then went back upstairs and did their thing. They started robbing the store. Not too long after they started robbing the store, 16-year-old Courtney Naisbitt entered the store. The reason he was there that evening is because he was running errands next door. He was developing photos for his father and wanted to stop by Hi-Fi and thank Stanley because Stanley let him park his car in the Hi-Fi Audio parking lot while he ran his errands next door. As soon as Courtney went in, Selby and Andrews took Courtney hostage downstairs. They tied him up and they sat him next to Stanley and Michelle. So later that night, Orrin Walker started to grow concerned because his son Stanley had not yet returned home from work, which was unusual. It was already past closing time, and it wasn't like Stanley to go out and not call home and let them know where he was. Orrin decided to head over to Hi-Fi Audio to see if he could find Stanley there. Maybe he was still there. So in addition to Orrin, Courtney's mother, Carol Naisbitt, also started to worry when her son did not return home from developing the pictures. Just like Stanley, it was unusual for Courtney not to call, let his parents know where he was, or if he was not going to be home for dinner. So Carol decided to head over to Hi-Fi Audio as well to see if she could find Courtney, because Courtney was next door to Hi-Fi Audio developing photos for his father. And after picking up the photos, he was due to come home for dinner. Carol had already called around to Courtney's friends to see if they had seen Courtney, but none of them had heard from him, so this is the reason why she decided to head over to Hi-Fi Audio and the picture store. As soon as Carol and Orrin arrived at Hi-Fi Audio, Andrews and Selby took them to the basement and sat them next to Stanley, Michelle, and Courtney. Carol was tied up and placed right next to her son, Courtney. When Carol got to Hi-Fi Audio, she noticed that the store was completely empty. While she was walking in, she started calling out. This is when Courtney heard her voice and just whispered to himself like, oh no, like my mom's here now. She's gonna be held hostage just like us. Orrin wasn't immediately tied up, but he was taken down to the basement. With 5 people being held hostage in the basement, Selby asked Andrews to go out to the van and get something. When Andrews came back, he had a paper bag with a bottle inside. And inside of that bag was a bottle of Drano drain cleaner. It's an extremely acidic liquid that's made of sodium hydroxide and sodium hypochlorite, which is another name for bleach. Selby poured some of the Drano into a green cup and commanded that Orrin give the Drano to the other people that were being held hostage, which of course Orrin refused to do. So when Orrin refused to give the other hostages the Drano, he was immediately gagged and pushed onto the floor with his face down. Selby and Andrews sat the hostages up so that they could pour the Drano cleaner into their mouth and they could swallow it easier. When the hostages asked what exactly that liquid was, they told them that it was vodka with some type of German drug or sleeping pill. They said this so that they would swallow the liquid without even questioning it. Michelle, who was begging for her life, was refusing to drink the liquid, but she was forced to drink it. As soon as the Drano touched their lips, giant blisters began to form, and the skin around their mouths began to burn away. Once they swallowed it, it began to burn their tongues, their throats, and their stomach. That's just so awful. Can you imagine being forced to drink Drano? That is the stuff of nightmares. And just, it must have been so incredibly horrible to have that burning sensation. As soon as it touched your skin. Once the hostages drank the Drano, they began screaming and gagging and going into convulsions. Selby was not happy because it was starting to get loud, so he decided that he would try duct taping their mouths shut so that they would be quiet and so that the Drano would stay in their mouths. But when they went to go put the duct tape on the hostages' mouths, it would not stick because of the blisters that had formed around their mouth and lips were oozing with pus. This, of course, did not allow the adhesive to stick to their skin. It's just, being the last one to be given the Drano, Orrin paid close attention to the reactions of the other hostages. He observed that they were screaming, going into convulsions, and just overall getting really sick from this Drano. When he was given a cup of Drano, he drank it, but then allowed it to pour from the side of his mouth so that he wouldn't swallow it. But it looked like he was drinking it and swallowing it. He started to fake convulsions and started screaming just like the other hostages had reacted when they drank the liquid. The robbery/hostage situation was getting complicated. It was getting messy and it was getting loud. This made Selby very angry. If you can even get any more angry than he already is, just an angry person. So because this made him angry, he decided to shoot the hostages. He began by shooting Carol in the back of the head, execution style. After Carol, he shot her son Courtney. It didn't take long for Carol to die from this gunshot wound to the back of her head. Selby then went over to Orrin and shot him in the head, but he had actually missed his head. After shooting Orrin, he went over to Stanley, his son, and shot Stanley in the back of the head. He then turned back to Orrin and shot him a second time. This time, the bullet only grazed his head. Selby then took Michelle to the far side of the basement where he pointed a gun at her head and forced her to take her clothes off. Andrews was standing right beside him, so he asked Andrews to leave for about half hour. And during this time, he repeatedly raped Michelle. After the torture he subjected Michelle to, she asked him to go to the restroom, which he allowed, but he stood there the entire time while she went to the bathroom. And I read the book Victims by, I don't know the name of the author, but I'll leave the information down in the description. It's really sad because Michelle, when she was going to the bathroom, she kind of joked around with Selby, saying, "Oh, you know, I must have drank a lot of that liquid," because she was peeing for quite a while. And that's just so sad that she was trying to like make conversation with Selby and hoping to maybe bring him back to reality with a little bit of humor, as dark as that is. It didn't work on Selby. Selby dragged Michelle back to the basement area where the other hostages were. Still naked, he threw her down right next to Stanley. He threw her down on her face, and he fatally shot her in the back of the head. Even after everything he put her through, she was the one who was begging for her life the most. She was crying, telling him that she was too young to die, that she didn't want to die. He takes her, he rapes her, shoots her afterwards. All of the hostages were pleading for their life. They were trying to negotiate with Selby and Andrews. They told them that if they let them go, they would never identify them, they would never say anything to anyone, and they would even let them steal whatever they wanted from the store as long as they let them go. Just Selby, being the monster he is, didn't hear any of their pleas. It's just ridiculous. So after Selby noticed that Orrin was still alive, or he had a suspicion that Orrin was still alive, he got on top of Orrin and began to strangle him with a wire. This did not work on Orrin because Orrin was tensing his neck muscles so that when he was trying to strangle him with that wire, the tension in his muscles would not allow him to strangle him, if that makes sense. Selby noticed that this wasn't working. He wasn't able to strangle Orrin for some reason. He instead grabbed a ballpoint pen. He put it in Orrin's ear and he stomped on it with his, so that it would go deep inside his ear canal. And the pen actually ended up puncturing his eardrum, coming out of his neck right here. Went through the eardrum and just got stomped in, and then just came out through here. So unbelievable. After subjecting these hostages to unbelievable torture, Selby went back upstairs and finished robbing the Hi-Fi audio store. They loaded the stolen equipment into the vans, finally left the store. Fortunately, 2 people survived. Unfortunately, the other 3 would die. Michelle Ansley, whose full name was Sherry Michelle Ansley, she died in the basement. She was only 18 years old, and she had only been hired 1 week before this happened. It's just so unfortunate. You know, she just started her job there. She was engaged to be married that year in August. Byron Courtney Naisbitt survived his attack. He was hospitalized for 266 days. He was unable to testify during the trial because he was suffering from amnesia from the different injuries he sustained that day. Even with the brain damage he suffered, Courtney would end up graduating from high school in 1976, and he would also get married. Unfortunately, he would suffer from chronic pain for the rest of his life. He passed away at the age of 44 on June 4th, 2002. Carol Elaine Naisbitt, Courtney's mother, who was 52 at the time, died at Ogden Regional Medical Center. Orrin William Walker, Stanley Walker's dad, survived with extensive injuries to his mouth, to his chin, the damage to his ear from the pen. He was able to testify against Selby and Andrews at trial. He would later die at the age of 69 on February 13, 2000. And last but certainly not least, Stanley Walker, who was 20 years old at the time. He was the manager of the audio store, passed away on this evening from a gunshot wound to his head. 3 hours after the attacks, Mrs. Walker and her son headed over to Hi-Fi Audio because not only had Stanley not come back home from work, Orrin, who went to go look for Stanley, had also not returned. So they both grew concerned and headed over to Hi-Fi. Once they got there, Mrs. Walker's son heard noises coming from the basement, so he kicked down the door and Mrs. Walker called the police. Not long after the news broke of the attack, police received an anonymous tip from an Air Force employee who worked at the Air Force Base with Andrews and Selby. He told police that a few months ago, Andrews had told him that he really wanted to rob the Hi-Fi Audio store, even if it meant killing whoever got in his way. Which is just so dumb. Like, why would you kill someone for audio equipment? But I can assure you that audio equipment does not warrant someone's death. The next tip came from two boys who were dumpster diving over at the Air Force Base, which is actually the same Air Force Base that Selby and Andrews were stationed at. They were there dumpster diving because they were collecting bottles that they would then turn in for money. When they went into this dumpster, they found a driver's license, they found a wallet, they found a purse, and they found a checkbook. They recognized the picture on the checkbook from the news report from the previous night, and so they called the police right away. When police arrived to the dumpster at the Air Force Base, there was a group of airmen gathered around the scene at the dumpster. One of the detectives that day wanted to try a new technique, if you will. The detective began taking each piece of evidence from the dumpster with tongs. Each time he would pull out an item, he would dramatically, wave it, kind of, like showing like, oh, here we have this wallet, here we have this purse. And he wanted to see what the reaction of the men were, because most of the men that were gathered stood there in silence, in awe of what they were witnessing. He wanted to see if he could get a reaction from any of the men when he pulled out the items from the dumpster. He had a strong feeling that the men they were looking for were in that group of men. And sure enough, he noticed that most of the men stood there in silence, except for two men who were walking around, being weird, making weird hand gestures, and being all loud. Because of the way they were reacting to this evidence being pulled from the dumpster, Andrews and Selby were arrested. Police searched their living quarters, and during that search, they found flyers for the Hi-Fi Audio store. And they also ended up finding a receipt for a storage garage that they had rented recently. Police immediately got a search warrant for the storage garage. When they got there, they found stereo equipment and a half-empty bottle of Drano and a green cup. They were able to confirm that the audio equipment in that garage was stolen from Hi-Fi because they had serial numbers to compare with the audio equipment. Of course, it was the audio equipment that was stolen from the store that night. Selby and Andrews were charged with first-degree murder and aggravated robbery. Police reports state that there were 6 men that night that had headed over to the Hi-Fi Audio store, but they were really all there to commit a robbery. They didn't really know that Selby intended to kill whoever got in their way of the robbery, which no one really did. They were begging and pleading with them to just take whatever they wanted, but that wasn't enough for them. And so Roberts and the other men, they stayed in the vans while Pierre Selby and William Andrews went into the store and initiated the robbery. And after the torturing and the killing by Selby, who was the one who actually shot the gun, after all that, after the whole ordeal, they then, helped load that equipment into the van before eventually driving off. Police did have enough evidence to convict Selby, Andrews, and Keith Leon Roberts, who was one of the guys who was in the van waiting outside. They didn't have enough evidence to convict the other men. Andrews was the one who came up with the idea of robbing the audio store. Selby was what they called the enforcer that night, and he was definitely the main killer. During the 4-day trial, beginning on October 15, 1974, the jury heard that Selby and Andrews had the intention of robbing the store and that they were willing to kill whoever got in their way. Months before they executed their plan, they looked for a way to commit the crime, to commit the murders in the quietest and cleanest way possible. The best method, in their opinion, came from a movie called Magnum Force. And in Magnum Force, there's a scene where a pimp is in a car with a prostitute and he wants to get rid of her. So he fills a cup with Drano and gives it to her to drink. And she immediately passes out and dies. They thought, this is what we're gonna do. So they ended up using this crazy method that night. Orrin Walker testified that Selby looked like he was enjoying himself that night. He was prancing around and had kind of a jump to his step, as if he was really enjoying what he was doing. Orrin stated that it was so hard for him to believe that he was even involved in this situation. The fact that he was there and he experienced just cruel treatment. His son's life was taken. He was forced to drink Drano. He witnessed the other four being forced to drink Drano and eventually get shot. Selby tried killing them 5 different times, and each time could have been fatal all in itself. Luckily for Orrin, he was a fighter and he survived those 5 attempts to be killed. The Walker family was traumatized. Their young son was so traumatized that he couldn't even sleep in his own room. He was afraid of going in the basement and would eventually resort to sleeping in his parents' room because he was just so scared. And his wife, Mrs. Walker, she spent a lot of her time in bed just trying to forget that any of it even happened. During one of the hearings for his millions of appeals after he was convicted, Selby stated that he did not plan for the night to go as it did. He said that the crime took a course of its own and he panicked that night because people just kept coming in. He blamed alcohol and pills that he had taken that night for his actions. He said that they altered his state of mind, that he wouldn't have normally acted that way, even though they had already watched the movie and decided what they were going to do to kill people who got in their way of stealing audio equipment. But Andrews contradicted Selby's statements. He said that he had never witnessed Selby be drunk or take drugs, and he definitely did not drink and take drugs on the night of their crime. During Andrews' clemency hearing, he argued that he was on drugs at the time of the crime and asked that his age be taken into consideration and asked that his age at the time of the crime be taken into consideration. But of course, his appeals were all denied. All of them. All of Selby's, all of Andrews' appeals were denied. In jail, Andrews wasn't any better though. His record indicated that in jail, he set fires, he concealed makeshift weapons, he had drugs, he had alcohol in his cell, he assaulted guards, and he also made plans to escape prison. He was definitely not a model prisoner. Andrews and Selby were not the most popular inmates at prison. Actually, they were extremely hated. Andrews and Selby had joint trials that lasted 4 days. And this is where it gets interesting. I can certainly see where people would question why the 2 men, Andrews and Selby, were sentenced the way they were. So that evening, Selby was the one who did all the killing. He's the one who did all the shooting. Andrews was there. He was as big of a crook as Selby. He was as big of a monster. But he never actually grabbed the gun and shot people. He was kind of just there, listening to whatever Selby was ordering him to do. He even told Selby at one point that he didn't want to go through with any violence or any killing, that, it just wasn't in him. He couldn't do it. And Selby took matters into his own hands and said, well, I'll do it. Andrews ended up going back upstairs for the most part of the killing. So he was actually upstairs while Selby shot all 5 hostages. So Andrews, even though he was there and witnessing what Selby was doing during some of the time, did not actually kill anyone. So I just wanted to point that out. They were both convicted of first-degree intentional homicide. So Selby, who was responsible for shooting all 5 victims, was convicted of first-degree intentional homicide. And his accomplice, Andrews, was also convicted for first-degree intentional homicide. They were both sentenced to death via lethal injection. Dale Selby Pierre would die on August 28, 1987 at the age of 34 via execution by lethal injection. And William Andrews would die on July 30th, 1992, age 37, via execution by lethal injection. Keith Leon Roberts was convicted of aggravated robbery, and he was not sentenced to death by lethal injection, and his criminal penalty was 5 years to life in prison. He was paroled on May 12, 1987, after just about 13 years in prison, and after being released from prison, he moved to Chandler, Oklahoma with family. Keith Leon Roberts would commit suicide on August 8, 1992, about a week after Andrews' execution. Tell me what you guys think about this case. What are your opinions on the convictions and eventual sentencing of Selby and Andrews? Do you think it was fair for Andrews to have been convicted of the same crime as Selby and sentenced to the same amount of time or death? Do you feel that it was fair that he was sentenced to death via lethal injection? I'd really like to hear what you guys think. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Take care, stay safe, and I hope to see you next time. Peace out.